Little Johnny had been warned never to go trick-or-treating at any house he didn't know, but he didn't listen. Instead, he convinces his friends to go get candy from this one weird house. Later that night, as they're all digging through their loot, there's this scream. All the kids are rushed to the hospital, but it's too late. Johnny's dead from eating candy laced with poison, and all the other kids had their mouths ripped open from swallowing razor blades and glass. They never did catch the person who did it. Turns out, Halloween really comes from the ancient customs of druids, collecting kids for sacrifices. And apparently, these murders were committed by those who still carry on that evil tradition. Welcome to Back Away Slowly. You're listening to episode 2 of our Urban Legends season. There are so many urban legends that I could choose for this season that I really debated if I should spend an episode covering today's topic. It feels like everyone else has mentioned it or told the main tragic story that's inseparable from it. However, as I looked into other urban legends, I found that this story was brought up over and over and over again. And the general fears expressed by this legend are ones that are impossible to disentangle from other urban legends. I think I've done enough research to hopefully bring some interesting information to the table that hasn't been said a million times.
It's a nice and scary time, isn't it? All those wonderful costumes and masks and makeup. I think about how much fun Halloween is. I also worry a little bit about the things that can spoil the fun of Halloween. Those kinds of things scare me too, but in a different way.
The short story in the beginning of the episode is an excerpt from the documentary Killer Legends. It's a very simple story, but one competing for elbow room with dozens of similar iterations, all repeating the same fear. All over the country, countless anonymous, horrible people eagerly await Halloween. On this night, they'll have the opportunity to stuff any number of harmful things into colorful candies given away to eager children. This fear became so great in the 1970s that it created a name for this deviant, the Halloween Sadist. Headlines and newspapers clambered over each other in their eagerness to terrify parents. In 1979, the New York Times wrote, quote, "That plump red apple that Junior gets from a kindly old woman down the block may have a razor blade hidden inside." Or how about this quote from Newsweek 5 years later, quote, "If this year's Halloween follows form, a few children will return home with something more than an upset tummy. In recent years, several children have died, and hundreds have narrowly escaped injury from razor blades, sewing needles, and shards of glass purposefully put into their goodies by adults." And dear God, if that's true, if several children have died almost every year since 1970, why aren't we talking about this more? But even at a cursory glance, you can see gaping holes in these claims. Hell, I can't even remember the last time anyone was handing out apples at Halloween, much less one with a razor blade hidden inside. Come to think of it, handing out an apple with a weapon inside in the 2020s would probably be one of the dumbest things you could do if you want to get away with hurting children. You'd be memorable because you were handing out apples instead of candy. Folklorist Brunvand tosses around the idea that the apple may have remained a common linchpin in this story because of its place in biblical history. After all, the apple was the forbidden fruit eaten by Eve, resulting in the casting out of man from the Garden of Eden. Though for now, I'll just skate past the fact that the Bible doesn't specify what fruit is on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit might not have been an apple at all, but maybe a pomegranate, a fig, or even grapes. But we get his point. The apple has a long perception in the public consciousness as relating to indulgence and the forbidden. If that's the case, does that mean that the child or consumer of the apple deserves the proverbial sting in the tail that the razor blade provides? I'm not sure, but it's definitely something to consider. However, Brunvand isn't completely sold on his first theory. He also suggests that apples are used as the vehicle of danger in the story simply because apples are in season during the autumn holiday. This makes a lot of practical sense to me. Apples are simply available. The villain of these stories are always insane child haters, thought to have had a deprived or even abusive childhood. From this dark past has grown an adult, now, quote, frustrated and filled with resentment against the world in general. But that's a lot of conjecture, so let's take a closer look at one of the most frequent threats of our childhoods: deadly Halloween treats. Folklorist and professor Heather Joseph Witham kindly explains the origins of Halloween as we know it. The earliest signs of a potential Halloween sadist came from a rumor in the 1940s. A prankster was supposedly heating up pennies before offering them to trick-or-treaters. What were the other early examples of this aggression towards children on Halloween?
If you look at sort of the history of Halloween, it's kind of a weird holiday to begin with because it started out as something a lot more culturally based and religious, not American at all. And it was called Samhain in the ancient Celtic world. And it had more to do with, dividing the year between the old and the new, the winter and the summer. So you're going into a dangerous time. So you're taking this hearth fire, this light of the summer of the community back to your home. You're trying to avoid dangers and spirits and fairies and anything that could cause you harm. And over time, this holiday, once various types of colonialism and religious persecution occurred, became something different. It became, forgotten until more or less the witch persecutions, and then it became sort of demonized, and then it became fun. It got Victorianized, and then ended up here, which is where it really became Halloween the way we know it. So even though it has its start in the Celtic world and then the British world, it really became what we know it as here. So it's particularly American, but it's rooted in these folk beliefs and superstitions and religious ideas and taboos, because going into the winter is scary. And because the church didn't like it and said, don't do this, we'll do All Saints Day instead, we'll do something else. And so it already is rooted in these ideas of demonization. And how we reacted to it was to make it fun and trickstery, which we liked and apparently needed at that time in early mid-American history. So I think all of this stuff is just sort of an intrinsic part of the holiday, rather than saying this is this one thing and it's rooted into that. Well, this is a weird holiday that we're now, even though we imported it, we're now exporting it. So England, for example, didn't celebrate Halloween for a long, long time. And now it's a big thing over there again. People are trick-or-treating and stuff like that. But keep in mind what trick-or-treating is, which is also part of the roots of what you're talking about. Trick-or-treating is going and asking for something from someone, or you'll get a trick instead. The roots of that kind of tradition is in annual festival carnival culture. So you would go house to house and say, hey, we need this chicken for the pot, and we're going to end up making this feast or money for the carnival that we're putting on in the south of France or, wherever you are. So it's already rooted in the culture. So people giving stuff for the betterment of the community. Well, trick-or-treat's almost the opposite. It's just for the betterment of you.
With that brief overview on the early days of Halloween, let's take a look at some supposed first-hand or second-hand stories of this danger. Most of these stories come from sociologist Joel Best from the University of Delaware, who collected and wrote about every story he could find. It became a kind of annual tradition for news outlets to reach out to Best and interview him as Halloween loomed ever closer. Other stories will come from newspapers that I managed to dig up. Let's take a look at our first story. Quote, I was born in 1957, and when I was about 7 years old, I brought home an apple among my Halloween treats. Back in the early 60s, lots of people in our suburban Los Angeles County neighborhood gave out whole fruit or homemade treats, such as popcorn balls. My parents didn't think much about it, or were even pleased that not everyone gave out sugary candy treats. We weren't allowed to eat more than a few pieces of candy at a time, so when I wanted to try the beautiful apple, my parents allowed me to. I took a bite into the fruit, and my front teeth came together, top and bottom, on something hard. I showed it to my mother, and she carefully cut apart the apple, revealing a straight-edged razor blade inside it. I was lucky enough to bite down just the way I did, and thus escaped injury. We did not report the incident to the police, but my parents immediately went through all the treats and discarded any that were not commercially prepackaged candies. We continued that process as long as I trick-or-treated, and I did the same with my own daughter. I know that a lot of these rumors that are spread come from secondary or greater sources, but this one actually happened. To me. I remember my confusion and dismay as a small child, wondering why some adult who probably didn't even know me would want me to suffer in this way. An oddly written story takes place in the 60s. Quote, I agree that you are right that it is very rare and not something that parents need to be too concerned about. But you are most definitely wrong that it has never happened. How do I know this? Because I was there. My account is firsthand. It happened at the house at the other end of the block, on our block, around the early to mid-60s in Blue Island, Illinois. And I was there to even see police effect an arrest. I think I was about 7 at the time. The house at the other end of the block was handing out apples to kids trick-or-treating. I got one of those apples. The apples had razor blades inserted into them. One of the other kids that got one of the apples bit into it and got cut, luckily not severely. Me, I saw a slice in mine and threw the apple away. I wasn't a big apple eater, so I wasn't hurt. But I was there. I saw this firsthand and got one of the contaminated apples. So don't even try to tell me that it's an urban legend, because I was there. As for the newspaper, I cannot tell you if it was in the paper or not, and if not, why it wasn't, but it most certainly happened. Another person wrote in, quote, I actually did receive a tainted treat as a child. I'm sure it was 1965, as I was 4 years old, and it was in Vineland, New Jersey. My mom drove us around door to door. When we got home, she looked in one of those small paper bags that had a bunch of loose raisins in it. She noticed that the raisins each had a small piece of a broken toothpick. Thought you'd be interested to hear this one anecdotal experience. I probably wouldn't eat the raisins anyway, and they were clearly visible. In any event, it was definitely more of a trick than a treat. This story is interesting, as we shift from razor blades to bits of toothpick. Not only are toothpicks easier to come by, but they strike me as being almost more sinister, other than the monster handing out raisins for Halloween. Since toothpicks are a kind of utensil for food, this particular sadist could claim plausible deniability, that the toothpicks broke off by accident, or something similar. Toothpicks, at least, have more of a reason to be in food than razor blades do. It was 1969 that newspaper reports really started to pick up on these accounts. On November 1st, 1969, the Circleville Herald reported, quote, a 2.5-year-old boy in Middletown, New York, suffered cuts in the mouth when he bit into an apple that had been loaded with a razor blade. According to the police in Columbus, Ohio, they got numerous reports from parents who had found razor blades, hat pins, bobby pins, needles, paper clips, screws, nails, and a partridge in a pear tree in their children's Halloween goodies. Somehow, none of these children had been harmed, thank God. Another little girl in New York found a candy bar with a needle stuck inside, and a father in Illinois was peeling an apple for his 5-year-old son when he found a razor blade in the fruit. 2 years later, the Lima News reported that in Akron and Cleveland, Halloween candy and fruit were contaminated with pins, razor blades, ground glass, nails, and screws. Again, no injuries were reported. According to this paper, the police, quote, believed the pins probably were placed in the candy bars before they were purchased. The article wrapped up with another discovery of treats containing a Gulf tea. The Dover Times reporter wrote about the expected reports from parents to the police, but then details started to change. Very early in the article, the police suspected that some of the candy was, quote, chemically contaminated. A Coshocton resident claimed that his kids ate candy bars, but that their mouths became numb and they felt ill. When the father checked the candy, he found pinholes in the bars, but the article didn't say if he actually found pins. Police Sergeant Dan Wood mentioned a child who'd eaten a bag of malted milk balls, who then felt sick. Quote, he said initial investigations indicated that the youth's illness stemmed from something in the candy, rather than from overeating. However, we never actually get any confirmation of a chemical contaminant, or a medical report, or any official confirmation that these kids weren't just eating too many sweets. Again, it doesn't mean something didn't happen, but we have no real evidence. On the same day, the Daily Gazette reported a whopping 24 states that collected over 300 reports of needles, pins, or razor blades in Halloween candy over the weekend. However, quote, police were unable to confirm all the incidents and disproved a few. Elmer McClung of Pittsburgh detailed Halloween candy bars with everything from glue to cat food hidden inside the treats. He also claimed, quote, one child got a little trick-or-treat bag with 3 razor blades in the bottom. A 1983 article from the Cincinnati Post suggests that parents, quote, cut up candy treats into small pieces to detect any foreign substances inside. A short anecdote sent to Joel Best reads, quote, just wanted to let you know that I grew up in Alaska. One year, maybe 1983 or 1984, I went trick-or-treating with a friend. One of her Snickers had a razor blade in it. So the police confiscated my candy, but no razor blades were in mine or my brother's. She narrowly escaped biting into the Snickers because she tried to share it. But here we have a more detailed personal experience. Quote, my incident happened Halloween night in 1984. I was 9 at the time, and I began hallucinating that night after eating a small amount of candy. Rushed to the hospital, I was treated by several doctors who had concluded I had symptoms of being given LSD. In the years since, I've seen many specialists, and I still do today, for a medical condition I now have as a result. My parents, who are still alive, have the police and hospital reports, which I've already verified myself as I got older and more curious. Personally, I've never seen this in any news report, and I'm not sure why. I do know my parents did their very best to keep the attention off of me, so that could be what happened. This happened in St. Clair Shores, Michigan, and the police were involved on November 1st, 1984, after I was already in the hospital. The police took all of the candy that me and my siblings received that night. It's been so long, and I do not know if they tested it. Based on the doctors and their tests on me is how they concluded that I had it in my system. This story's quite interesting for a few reasons. One is that I find it odd that there were no news reports or public warnings after this supposedly verified incident, though this could be the authorities trying to avoid a panic. The story also gives a lot of details, including the date and a specific location. But despite all of these details, I was also unable to find any reports from that area or year reporting on LSD-laced candy being investigated by the cops. Here's another story that takes place around 2002. Quote, I was around 6 years old, I'd say, so 20 years ago, and my dad took me trick-or-treating near the Fort McCoy area in Florida. We didn't make it to too many houses that night, but there was one house that was having a party. I knocked on the door and said, trick or treat, smell my feet, when they opened it. The people who opened the door just laughed and told me they'd be right back and closed the door. They then opened it and gave me a full-size Snickers bar. I guess my dad got bad vibes from them, maybe because of their mannerisms, which I didn't notice because I was only a kid. We get back to the car and my dad immediately opened the candy bar wrapper. He noticed a tiny hole in the candy bar. He then broke it close to where the hole was, and there was a needle inside. I don't remember what kind of needle it was, but it was definitely there. It was never reported. After that, my parents always checked all of my candy bars. Now, a lot of people don't believe me, and I totally get why, but this is something that happened to me in real life, and I know I can't be the only one. I thought maybe I just imagined it as a kid, but my dad confirms it really did happen. The idea of a group of adults who all think the idea of putting a needle into candy is hilarious is definitely horrifying. It also suggests that this kind of danger is easy to create in a split second. How long would it take for one of these partiers to stick a needle into a candy bar? Frankly, no time at all. And if not for the vigilance of the dad, this story could have ended very differently. I also don't know why the dad didn't call the police, since he immediately checked the candy right after getting it, but that chance is long gone. The last report we'll discuss is from an incredibly rude member of the public, practically rabid to tear Joel Best a new one in 2022. Quote, "For a professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware, I am completely shocked, disappointed, and very upset with your uneducated, ill-informed, and totally baseless cavalier attitude and article posted today on CNN regarding the very real, fact-based threats of rainbow-colored fentanyl that DEA agents have actually found inside tens of thousands of sealed boxes and bags of Halloween candy entering the United States all along the border with Mexico and Canada too. So while it may be safer in your Disney-like area of Delaware, I live in Texas, and my fiance and her 10-year-old daughter live close to the Arizona border with Mexico, and, unlike you, we are in danger of receiving boxes and/or bags of Halloween candy that contains rainbow-colored fentanyl." Now, I understand and even agree with you with the premise of your article, i.e. that, based on your extensive and historically accurate research, most Halloween candy concerns are mostly harmless urban legends that media outlets use to increase viewership and readership. However, you have knowingly and purposefully endangered tens of thousands of children by writing your article essentially telling parents not to be concerned about their kids being harmed by fentanyl. Perhaps you are not aware of the secret proxy drug war that has been raging in the United States for many years, where Russia, China, Iran along the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, both of which are the world's largest producers of heroin harvested from poppy flowers. Perhaps you don't know that the ingredients for fentanyl, ecstasy, MDMA, and heroin are mostly produced in and exported from China and Russia to the United States. The Chinese and Russians were partly behind the astounding increase in heroin, opioid, and fentanyl addiction, and an explosion in the death rates for each one caused by overdosing. And perhaps you are also unaware that my 16-year-old stepdaughter cannot drink from any container that has been out of her possession for any period of time because rainbow-colored fentanyl is so pervasive in all of the high schools throughout the Dallas area that kids are literally spiking or dropping the tiny candy-like fentanyl pills into other kids' drinks or soda cans for fun, just to watch them get high without knowing it. Or perhaps you haven't spoken to the emergency room staff as I did over the weekend, who told me they are seeing record-breaking numbers of fentanyl overdoses. I could go on, but you get my point. And if it were possible, you should have to pay for all of the medical bills, the mental anguish, and the funerals of the children whose deaths you caused. Wow. Okay. So, where do I start with that? The raging hero complex? The dripping acidity of xenophobia? The lack of literally any sources? You know what? I think that's all the time I want to give to that person. However, the reason I include that entry at all is to illustrate exactly how terrified some people are of this urban legend, even today, and how seriously they take these stories. Going back to the height of the legend's popularity, what exactly did parents do in light of this looming threat? According to Joel Best,
some schools stop celebrating Halloween. They stop using the word Halloween, and they start talking about having a fall festival. New Jersey passed a law specifying penalties for people who were caught contaminating Halloween trees. In the 1980s, hospitals began offering to x-ray treats. We don't worry about ghosts and goblins anymore, but we fear this maniac, this anonymous person who is so crazy that presumably he, poisons little children at random.
I've heard of the X-raying Halloween candy practice, though my family never went to a hospital to do so.
All NextCare urgent care locations are offering free candy X-rays through tomorrow.
We haven't had any instances where we found any tampered candy, but you read it in the news and you see all of these crazy pictures online. And so, if I were a parent, I would be a little bit concerned as well.
And eventually, this practice would be challenged by radiologists, as it would provide a false sense of security, since X-rays can't detect drugs or poisons. And besides, even when it was a common practice, few items were found, if ever. And if the X-ray practice isn't really effective, then it's also just keeping the panic around the Halloween sadist alive, without any real benefit. By the 90s, shopping malls saw an opportunity. They started to encourage parents to bring their kids to the mall, and they could trick-or-treat in stores. Churches and schools started the now remarkably hated trunk-or-treat, where people park their cars in the same lot, and the kids go get candy from the trunks. On the surface, this appears to provide security, since the family would know the members of the congregation. But wouldn't the family know the members of the neighborhood about as well as they would a congregation? The benefits seem more heavy-handed for the organizations themselves. Malls get more people in and out of their stores. Churches get more people at their events. And schools get to hide behind fall fests, which gives them space to deny that they support a holiday that's long been accused as being satanic. Kids were encouraged not to take homemade treats, that it was safe only to accept mass-produced candy in intact packaging.
You see, some people think it's fun to play tricks with your treats. Watch out for candy wrappers that have been torn or punctured. That might be a sign of tampering. There might be things in the candy, so break open candy bars before you eat them. Cut fruit into pieces before you eat it, just in case something's been stuck in it. Watch out for things that look like candy, but might be medicines or drugs, or even poisons. Don't eat anything that doesn't look right. If it looks funny, it might not be so funny if you ate it.
But it's hard to ignore that encouraging the public to only give out commercial candy, well, that definitely makes certain companies a lot of money. Well, after all of these reports and the sheer terror of communities all across the US, who's actually died from the efforts of a Halloween sadist? There are a few relevant cases, so let's take a look. The first documented case of tainted candy was in 1964, Long Island. In a tale as old as time, housewife Helen Pfeil was so angry that older kids were out trick-or-treating that she handed out dog biscuits, steel wool, and poison ant buttons. When she got in trouble, she naturally backpedaled by claiming it was all just a harmless, poisoned, degrading joke. Despite this weak excuse, she was still found guilty of endangering children. Detroit, Michigan, 1970. 5-year-old Kevin Totson fell into a coma the day after eating some of his Halloween candy. After an autopsy, the doctors at Children's Hospital declared his death had been caused by an overdose of narcotics. An analysis of his candy revealed heroin mixed with quinine in powder form. Kevin's mother, Mrs. Ida Foster, told the police that Kevin had spent Monday night at her brother's home, that of Henry Coleman. This was heavily publicized, the press happy to leap on the urban legend train yet again. What was significantly less reported was the findings that there had been heroin found at the home of the uncle, Henry Coleman, and that this had been a case of accidental contamination. So again, people were hearing about the scary death, but they never learned about the result of the investigation. But it would be a horrible tragedy in Pasadena, Texas, that would fan the flames of Halloween sadism terror for decades to come. In 1974, the O'Brien and Bates children had just wrapped up a long night of trick-or-treating on Halloween. Before bed, Ronald O'Brien agreed to let his 8-year-old son Timothy and his 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth each have one piece of candy. Still wearing his Planet of the Apes costume, Timothy picked out a giant pixie stick. His father rolled the stick in his hands to break up the sugar and poured it into his son's mouth. But something something wasn't right. Timothy started violently vomiting over and over again. They rushed him to the hospital, but the cyanide was faster. Pasadena Police Lieutenant Ed Goad had been off duty that night, but a detective summoned him to Southmore Hospital.
I was off duty at the time on Halloween night when I received a call from one of my detectives. I drove to Southmore Hospital, and what I saw was very, very disturbing, not only because there was a child there that was dead, that had cyanide foam coming out of his mouth, but it was a small, blonde-headed young boy. And I looked at this child, and I had at the time a small, blonde-headed 8-year-old son lying in a bed in my home. And it absolutely just almost destroyed you to see something like that. But, you're always concerned on Halloween. And the next night we had a grieving father, a grieving mother, and a grieving little sister. I put my arm around Mr. O'Brien's shoulder and I promised him, I promise you, we will catch this individual that did this to your son.
The family struggled to grieve their son, while still contributing to the murder investigation. One moment, Mr. O'Brien was singing a hymn at his son's funeral. The next, he was speaking to reporters of how he held his dying son in his arms. The public was clutched with terror. This wasn't just a dangerous prank. There was no debate that this was very obviously a premeditated murder. Mr. O'Brien told the papers, quote, "It's so disheartening to think that there wasn't more we could do. We thought we were being so careful. We had even wondered if we should go out this year." But nothing could turn back time, and all they could do now was catch the murderer. The police drove Mr. O'Brien around the neighborhood, prompting him to identify the house that had given out the pixie sticks. Although pixie sticks may seem unique enough to remember, after a whole night of trick-or-treating, it was proving difficult for Mr. O'Brien to remember the exact house they'd come from. But eventually, Mr. O'Brien pointed the finger at neighbor Courtney Melvin. But he had an airtight alibi. The police interviewed Mr. O'Brien to walk through exactly what happened that night. The group of kids had walked up to a house and rang the doorbell, but after a minute or two, no one had answered. Mr. O'Brien told the other kids to go ahead, and he'd wait for the homeowner to come to the door. Mr. O'Brien caught up to the group a short time later, carrying 5 pixie sticks. He split the sticks up between Elizabeth, Timothy, one of the Bates kids, and local boy Whitney Parker. No other witnesses. Just Mr. O'Brien running up with 5 pixie sticks, all of which would later be revealed to also contain cyanide. Police dug deeper, and what they found would shake the community to its core.
On Halloween night, 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien of Pasadena, Texas, died after eating a piece of trick-or-treat candy that contained cyanide. Today, Pasadena police arrested the boy's father, 30-year-old Ronald O'Brien, on murder charges. Police refuse to discuss the case other than to say the district attorney believes he has sufficient evidence to file charges.
The police discovered that Mr. O'Brien had taken out a large life insurance policy, not on himself or his wife, but on his children. Of course, Mr. O'Brien vehemently denied any of these charges. How could the police think such a thing? But Mr. O'Brien hadn't been as slick as he'd like to believe, especially when he'd spoken to numerous people about death by cyanide, and even tried to purchase it from local companies. In 2014, the documentary team interviewed former Assistant District Attorney Mike Hinton about the case.
I thought, just like Mr. O'Brien wanted us to think, that there was some maniac out there randomly giving these poison pixie sticks to little kids. That's exactly what he wanted us to think, and that's what we thought. It's hard to accept that a human being was willing to do that.
But it's already hard enough to accept that anyone would want to kill children, let alone a parent. Other than self-serving denials, the repeated lies to save his own skin, what scares me most about this case is that there were 4 other pixie sticks. He was willing to murder not only his own children, but but to kill any other child for the sake of an alibi, anything to get his payout. He was fully prepared for there to be at least 4 dead children by the end of the week. And here's the piece of shit himself.
Are you ever going to change your proclamation of innocence, or?
No, why should I? It's the truth. When you consider victims, the victim of this crime actually turns out to be me.
I actually felt a little queasy as I watched the documentary and heard that. It's truly disgusting and absolutely inhuman. And clearly, I wasn't the only one to think so. It took a jury 45 minutes to find him guilty, and another 75 to sentence him to death. Though he was scheduled to be executed on Halloween 1976, this was postponed as the ethical debate of the death penalty flared up. 9 years later, still on death row, a reporter brought up that Mr. O'Brien had been accused of ruining Halloween for everyone.
You are accused of ruining Halloween for everybody.
Well, that's a matter of opinion.
March 31st, 1984. People paced outside of the prison gates, including the parents of other murdered children. They screamed, they raged, furious that this monster had taken his own child's life, when these parents would do anything to have their own children back with them. At 12:40 a.m., O'Brien was injected with twice the standard amount of the lethal drugs to account for his 250-pound body weight. Folklorist Sylvia Gritter of Texas A&M University studied this case, concluding that Mr. O'Brien was, quote, the only person ever convicted of acting out an urban legend and carrying it to the ultimate conclusion: murder. Mr. O'Brien, beyond being a monster who destroyed his own family, also desecrated Halloween, says Professor Bill Ellis from Penn State. Sure, Halloween is about spooky stories and scary events, and nearly all fictional. But Mr. O'Brien took this holiday of make-believe, using an urban legend as a smokescreen to protect his number one priority: himself. But there are still a few more short cases to get to. In 1978, 2-year-old Patrick Viderhold of Flint, Michigan, died after eating Halloween treats. However, when tissue samples were tested for traces of poison or drugs, nothing was found. No bruises, no broken bones, no other obvious signs of foul play. Other children who'd been trick-or-treating in the same group all ate candy, but none suffered any side effects, though the parents threw the remaining treats out just in case. Eventually, the cause of death was given as natural causes. Over a decade later, in 1990, 7-year-old Ariel Katz of Santa Monica, California, collapsed while trick-or-treating and running around with the other kids. The adults present said she appeared to have tripped and fallen, but she didn't get up. The news was, again, eager to rave about the dangers of Halloween, despite her parents informing the police that she had a heart murmur, though the Toponaga Messenger would incorrectly report that she had no history of a heart disorder. The coroner would later attribute her death to an enlarged heart. Another decade later, in 2001, an unnamed 4-year-old girl died after eating some Halloween candy. However, pathology tests revealed no evidence of poisoning, and her autopsy concluded that she'd passed of a streptococcus infection. So let's review. Of the 5 deaths frequently attributed to Halloween sadism, the first was a drug contamination caused by a family member. The second was a cold-blooded murder from within the family. The third was officially listed as natural causes. The fourth was due to an enlarged heart. The fifth was a streptococcus infection. So, as of yet, despite countless first and second-hand stories, there's not a single death confirmed to have been from a Halloween sadist.
The idea that this is a big social problem is a myth. I can't tell you that nobody's ever contaminated a piece of candy, but I can't find any evidence that anybody has ever been hurt, seriously hurt, or killed from a contaminated treat picked up in the course of trick-or-treating.
So let's look at the evidence for why Halloween sadism potentially doesn't exist. In the early 1980s, Joel Best and his research assistant pored over articles having to do with Halloween sadism from the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune, which were the leading newspapers across the 3 largest U.S. urban areas. They cataloged all of the reports of contaminated treats. To save you from a list of years and report numbers, I'll simply say how many reports were found for each decade. The report started in 1959, with only 1 article being found. In the 60s, 25 articles were recorded. The terror of the poisoned candy truly exploded in the 70s, when 38 reports were tracked down. By the 80s, the number dropped sharply, only hitting 15 articles. The 90s saw this number cut by more than half, all the way down to 6 reports. The 2000s stayed the exact same, having 6 articles across papers. The 2010s saw a bit of a climb, reporting 19 incidents, the biggest spike being in 2018 with 8 articles. And finally, while the article written by Joel Best only went through 2024 for obvious reasons, the years 2020 through 2024 have 16 reports so far. We're going to go over some specific reasons why some years have the numbers that they do, but I assume that we're all seeing the same overarching problem. According to the most stressed news reporters and frightened parents, there were hundreds of reports. Well, if you actually do your research, you find that the most reports found across a decade doesn't even hit 50. And if we take a closer look at some of these reports, the layers built up around the urban legend of Halloween sadism begin to fall away. For example, one case was of a 55-year-old man who ingested a needle possibly hidden in a caramel apple. From what we know, this 55-year-old man wasn't trick-or-treating. Though pins being hidden in apples is concerning, this concern is separate from kids receiving contaminants while trick-or-treating, or because Halloween is an evil holiday that brings out evil people. Another report was from an adolescent who showed up at a hospital on Halloween, suffering from abdominal pain. He claimed it was because he'd eaten a commercially wrapped cupcake from a gas station, implying that it had been poisoned. But later, he admitted that he'd actually overdosed with prescription medication. So this also implies that some people are using the urban legend as a way to avoid admitting their own mistakes or practices. Best also referenced a survey of police departments in 24 of the nation's largest cities, also including a few smaller towns where highly publicized incidents supposedly occurred. All they had to show by the end of digging to the bottom of hundreds of candy tampering reports was 2 verified injuries, neither of which required medical treatment. Best even referenced emergency rooms, who stated that among 8 holidays, Halloween ranked 4th in terms of injuries. The 3 above it were Labor Day, Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Easter. But wait a minute. If there are so few verified incidents of poisoned or otherwise tampered candy, what about all of those first-hand accounts that were sent to Best? Does this imply that there are dozens of children like the victim from the first story we mentioned, who suffered in silence, their experience not being reported? Well, I don't know many parents who wouldn't go to the police after an attempt on their child's life, but not every family has had the privilege to view the police as trustworthy or safe. However, it'd be pretty easy to reverse engineer a cookie-cutter story that hits all of the emotional beats, built from the countless retellings of this urban legend. Or, it's possible that some of these stories come from concerned citizens, frustrated with Best's findings, which we certainly saw in the last Furious entry. How dare this man not take these stories seriously? They've been told for decades, everyone knows they're true. Then you get an idea. Maybe you should just send in an angry email with a shocking story, true or not. That would hopefully spur parents to be more diligent and to keep their children safe. An act of vigilantism done in the best interest of the children. But then again, we talked about ostension in the first episode of the season. It's certainly not unheard of for people to replicate the story of an urban legend, particularly when it's so easy to do without getting caught. Breaking off a toothpick in a raisin, slipping a needle into a packaged candy bar. These are disturbingly easy, cheap, and quick ways to hurt somebody else. And after an entire night of filling a bag with candy, it would be difficult to remember which house handed out which candy. Best himself theorized that when there's a spike in the news reports about Halloween sadists, that it might inspire copycat or ostensive behavior. Best writes, quote, "Because it's impossible to prove a negative, I can't say that there have never been incidents of children being harmed. What I can say is that I've reviewed press coverage back to the late 1950s, and I have not found reports of serious injury, nor have lots of people contacted me with stories that suggest Halloween sadism is widespread but unreported." And despite that handful of stories that we discussed earlier, they're just that, a handful. There's a possible culprit that we haven't discussed: the children themselves. The urban legend of the Halloween sadist has been around for over 60 years, so chances are children know about it. They've probably been warned once or twice by parents, teachers, and friends to beware their own Halloween candy. So any child who discovers a contaminated treat would get quite a bit of attention and concern from parents or even police officers, doctors, and reporters. One of the newspapers we previously mentioned, the one where 24 states reported over 300 incidents, a paragraph reads, quote, "One 12-year-old South Philadelphia boy was accused of putting a razor blade in a candy bar and then claiming he found it that way." When the Killer Legends crew asks Best who he thinks is carrying on the Halloween sadist's tradition, he says,
Probably the kids. If you think about it, this is a terrific kind of prank. It's easy enough to come by a pin and easy enough to stick it into the candy bar and then run in and say, "Look, Mom, there's a pin in my candy bar." And you become the object of the concerned attention of your parents and possibly even the press and the police.
But it's possible that there's a more children of the corn theory as well. This is perhaps most effectively illustrated from a story sent in to Joel Best in 2021. Quote, "Every year at this time, I remember that as a kid in the early 1970s, I did in fact bite into a Halloween apple from my candy bag and cut my gums pretty well on a blade that was placed in the apple. I didn't get any medical attention, but I did bleed badly for some time. I think I might have been too upset by the entire event to even tell my parents at the time. Interestingly, it wasn't a razor blade, but rather the blade from a pencil sharpener. At this time, this seemed to me to obviously indicate this had been done by another child, who would have an easier time getting one of those than a razor blade. I did look at the apple and found the slit where the blade had been inserted. At the time, this sort of nastiness did not seem beyond imaginable for some of the kids I knew in school." So here we have the chilling theory that these stories might have origins not in malicious adults, but in devilish peers. And the weapons chosen for this mischief were items that are all very easy to get their hands on. A needle from Mom's sewing, a razor from Dad's kit, a blade from a school pencil sharpener. It's the perfect crime with an almost guarantee to not be caught. But I think it's important to clarify something. There's a difference between crimes that occur around Halloween or Halloween candy and a Halloween sadist. Actions taken by a true sadist are done purposefully for pain and torture, with little to no other motive. So if kids are putting things into treats to get attention, that isn't Halloween sadism. They didn't put weapons in treats for the joy of causing torture. Their reason for doing this would be more out of curiosity or for attention, not because they thrive in the pain and suffering of others. Remember the rumor from the 1940s? The prankster heating up pennies? That is a Halloween sadist. That's someone going through the efforts to cause pain, and most importantly, they would be able to witness the pain immediately. That's something we haven't really discussed, but it's a significant part of a sadist's pleasure, seeing the pain they've inflicted. They don't get that if they put a tainted candy into your bag and you wander away. They won't even know if you've actually been hurt by it. But of course, this wouldn't be sustainable, since there would be a good number of witnesses who saw you place hot pennies into a kid's palm, as well as no excuse for your actions. Though I'd like to point out, despite Halloween having been 4th on the list provided by emergency rooms, there is very real danger on Halloween night. It's just not from sadists. Annually, safety tips are printed by newspapers and magazines, mostly focusing on flammable costumes, masks that block a child's vision, and most dangerously, the potential for a child to be struck by a car in the dark, particularly if they themselves are wearing a dark costume.
This little witch doesn't know it, but she's taking some frightening chances of being hurt, maybe badly hurt. Her costume is very, very dangerous. Can you see the things that make it dangerous? What about that mask? She can hardly see through those tiny holes for her eyes. You can see straight in front of you, but unless you happen to turn your head, you wouldn't see that car coming as you start to cross the street. You could be run over. And unless you look down, you can't see that you're coming to a curb. Ow, that hurts. It's bad enough to take a tumble on hard pavement, but it would be even worse to sprawl out on the street in front of a car coming.
Joel Best echoes this concern, pointing to studies that show a child's risk of being struck by a car is 4 times higher on Halloween, with child pedestrian fatalities being higher than any other time of year. Well, we've trudged through the evidence, and it seems pretty cut and dry. So why and how exactly does this urban legend live on? After all, quote, it's not much of a legend. It lacks a compelling narrative and can be summed up in a single sentence. Bad people give innocent trick-or-treaters contaminated treats. Compared to most contemporary legends, this seems pretty thin, and yet the tale endures. First of all, if a kid came running up to me with a deadly item in a piece of candy, my first instinct wouldn't be to accuse them of faking it. When it comes to children in particular, caution is always the best policy. Next, we have to take a look at the nature of urban legends in general. Halloween sadism combines 2 common themes in urban legends: danger to children and contamination in food. And there is a factual basis for these concerns. For example, plenty of soft drink manufacturers have been sued by people who have found mice in their drinks. And there have been plenty of horrible people who revel in the torture and harm of children. So with these 2 valid concerns, mix in an incident or 2 where something's found in a piece of candy, tag on a sensational headline, and the fire catches. And with decades of headlines having been printed, there are plenty of incidents to point to. At least to people who don't bother to read the articles, or to follow up on the findings of those incidents. And then we have to back up to look at US culture at large. How society functions has changed so much across the decades. During World War II, the country was collectively focused on working together to provide for the war effort. When the war ended and soldiers came home, they found that the expectations for the family unit had changed, particularly when it came to women working. This led to a collective focus on individual families and an attempt to reestablish what it meant to be an American family. The 60s and 70s saw increasing divisiveness within the American public. The incredibly unpopular Vietnam War, ghetto riots, student demonstrations, increased drug use. All of this seemed to prove that America was no longer safe for children. Public warnings came out one after another: child molestation, kidnappings, sexual abuse, child pornography, grooming. This was all buttressed by physicians and social workers insisting that child abuse was a major social problem. The press then responded with dozens of dramatic stories of children being abused by their parents. Ignoring that the perpetrators of this abuse came from within the family, the public focused on the affirmation that children were all potential victims. It wasn't if, but when. Quote, "But even parents who remained confident that their children would never be abused could worry about losing their children to other threats. Parents again looked overseas to the Vietnam War, at the draft of young men, which constantly made them question if there was any hope for the next generation." Reports of child abuse sharply inclined in the early 80s, sparking campaigns against incest, child pornography, child molesting, and abortion. Even slasher films seem to assert that this fear for children was based in reality. Movie after movie of psycho killers played in theaters over the years, a particularly relevant for this topic film being Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, where the entire plot revolves around murdering millions of children. These vicious characters were brought even closer by playing on the home television around Halloween, annually reviving the possibility of murder. But there were specific incidents that carved themselves into the minds of the public. The first happened in September of 1982 in the Chicago area. While I won't go into the entire case, as it's quite extensive, the brief summary is that 7 people were killed by cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol. In the weeks that followed, the reports poured in of hundreds of copycats who were contaminating food and over-the-counter medications. This event wreaked such havoc on the public that it would be the incident that created the tamper-proof seals you still see on medicines today. And even after all of the efforts to track down the perpetrator, no one was ever caught. This seemed to aggravate the already raw fears of Halloween sadism. The murderer was still out there. Considering this happened a month before Halloween, these murders were front and center as October arrived. This theory is confirmed when we take a look back at the article chart assembled by Joel Best. While I only said the total of Halloween Sadist reports across each decade, the chart says that the year 1982 specifically had 12 reports alone. The other 3 years that had reports in the 80s only had 1 each. Quote, "The candy industry was concerned enough to pay for researchers to follow up on all known reports of contaminated candy. This report concluded that virtually all of the reported cases were hoaxes." Even the 9/11 terrorist attacks, again occurring only a month before Halloween, prompted more fear of Halloween night. Unsubstantiated stories flashed across America, from city to city. A popular one was that a woman's Afghani boyfriend disappeared, only leaving her a note telling her not to fly on September 11th or to go to the mall on Halloween. Another feverish rumor was that trick-or-treaters received cupcakes containing slips of paper with messages in Arabic, thought to be terrorist messages. Then there was a story that terrorists had purchased large amounts of candy just before Halloween. None of these stories were true, but it's easy to see how Americans, understandably terrified by such a traumatizing event, were frantically trying to foresee where the next attack would come from. The panic of legalizing weed in Colorado in 2014 manifested as police warnings to parents that children might be given pot-infused candy on Halloween, especially since they had absolutely zero evidence that this was a real threat or that it had ever happened. The video can still be found on YouTube, posted by the Denver Police's channel. In the video, Patrick Johnson, the owner of Urban Dispensary, describes how the THC-infused gummy bears appear indistinguishable from regular gummies, warning parents to inspect all treats. Despite this concern, there were absolutely zero reported cases of children who ate THC-infused candy, or any admitted to hospitals for poisoning. September 2019 saw press coverage discouraging vaping THC. In October, Pennsylvania police seized THC-infused candy brought to the state illegally, but again, no candy contamination reports occurred. Very similar to the Colorado police video, in late August of 2022, the Drug Enforcement Administration issued a press release that warned parents that fentanyl pills were being manufactured in all kinds of bright colors and shapes. They even went one step further and claimed that this was a, quote, deliberate effort by drug traffickers to drive addiction amongst kids and young adults. This alone didn't cause much of a spike. What did move the peg was Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel, who, on September 20th, worriedly announced, quote, "Every mom in the country is worried. What if this gets into my kid's Halloween basket?" This immediately sparked skepticism, but when other politicians and Fox News backed her up, the coverage surged, especially since the November midterm elections lay just past Halloween and provided a great opportunity for politicians to appear to care about children. The amount of coverage this incident got was extremely unusual, even in comparison to the past. This breathed life back into the urban legend yet again. But the results were predictable. No reports of rainbow fentanyl treats in the US. Despite all of the concern from politicians, once Halloween and the midterm elections passed, the conversation around Halloween and contaminated candy strangely died out immediately. Who do we point to when it comes to the survival of this urban legend? On one hand, we could lay the blame on news reporters. They are the ones who fan the flames of public paranoia for the sake of viewership.
Halloween is on Sunday, and there's a spreading fear that this year the real Halloween scare will be many more cases of contaminated treats.
However, Joel Best says, quote, "Reporters sometimes invite me to blame media coverage for public concern about Halloween sadism. But there is a basic problem with this thesis. There isn't a lot of coverage, because there isn't a lot of Halloween sadism to report." He also points out that how Halloween sadists are covered has also changed. Instead of jumping at shadows and warning everyone to be on alert for unknown sickos, in the past decade or so, quote, "media coverage of Halloween sadism is most likely to involve little more than local news anchors cheerfully reminding parents to check their kids' treats."
To be completely safe, save your treats until you get home. Then ask your parents to help you check them carefully to make sure that there's nothing in them or on them that could hurt you. The safest treats are usually candy or gum that come in their own wrappers from the factory.
It's handled with more of a "what's the harm in checking" mentality, as opposed to impressing on the public that tragedy will happen. However, we still can't let news stations and companies off the hook. Despite decades of no real evidence, it doesn't stop the news companies from clambering over each other to warn the public about THC candies, acid-laced treats, and the like, at the first sign of, well, anything. And while they'll splash the attention-grabbing headlines across the front page, they bury or outright avoid reporting on the debunking of these claims. The police aren't much help either. Whenever they post videos about the threat of marijuana gummies being handed out at Halloween, which from what I can find hasn't happened and has no real basis, they create this air of validity around the fears of Halloween sadism. How we get our news is also a contributing factor. For example, when a mass fax message reached parents warning about poisonous face paint, parents naturally rushed to check labels for the fake ingredient mentioned in the fax. However, when a very real warning was sent out 3 days later, almost no one heard about the recall of over 6,000 vinyl vampire capes. And this was truly concerning, considering the capes were so flammable that if a child came within several feet of a jack-o'-lantern, they could burst into flames. These days, many of us get our news from social media. Newspaper readership is down, people almost avoid news stations for a variety of reasons. But this also means that we're only taking in what our digital feed decides we'd individually be interested in, not the warnings that we need to know about. People were already really bad about reading a crazy article, accepting it as gospel, and moving on without doing anything to verify that information. But it's even worse now. Despite having more information available than ever before, people just want to hear a crazy story and then move on to the next one. There's quite a paper trail of people using social media to instigate a Halloween sadism hoax in order to harvest views. In 2015, Facebook posts in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Ontario, and Alberta popped up around hidden objects and candies. But when these reports were followed up on, it was revealed that only one child found a dangerous item in a candy, and that child quickly admitted that their report was a lie. But there was no one around to hear the truth. They'd already moved on. In the same year, a Facebook user posted a photo of colorful pills in shapes like skulls that they claimed were ecstasy. Of course, this user fanned the fires of concern by saying they might be given out as candy to children. The warning circulated on Facebook, and when it received a boost in October, the Jackson, Mississippi Police Department repeated the warning. The police department hadn't bothered to check if there was any truth to the post, and their decision to pass on the claim and warnings established by a single Facebook user offered a validity to that fear. Of course, nothing came of it. In 2017, a 57-year-old Connecticut man was charged with second-degree breach of peace after he self-titled himself the Halloween Lunatic and posted to Facebook that he planned to give kids candy contaminated with rat poison. Ronald Seabiwo was investigated for these claims and was charged with a second-degree breach of peace for his posts, as well as 7 counts of animal cruelty. Let's just say his home wasn't pretty when officers arrived. But fortunately, the 3 dogs, 3 cats, and an Amazon African bird were removed from his care. But it's 2025. With all the information and reports that we have, why do people still believe the Halloween Sadist urban legend now? Quote, "Even as we live in an era of unparalleled prosperity and security, we are surrounded by apocalyptic warnings about nuclear war, nuclear winter, overpopulation, pollution, resource depletion, climate change, economic collapse, pandemic diseases, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, asteroid strikes, and on and on. We live in an era of uncertainty and a lack of control. We can't seem to stop school shootings. Kids are relying on forms of AI to educate them, or rather avoid learning altogether. More wars, digital threats, governments that threaten basic human rights. All of these issues feel enormous and hopeless. However, we can go out with our kids as they trick-or-treat. We can keep kids out of the road so they aren't struck by cars. We can examine the candy they receive on Halloween night. The Halloween Sadist gives us someone to blame, a villain closer to home that maybe we can find and hold accountable. Some groups want to eliminate Halloween altogether, pointing to the urban legend as to why they should. But they're pointing at thin air. It's the illusion of control. Heather Joseph Witham also points to our fear of those that America thought it used to know, our neighbors.
This is also a societal issue because by having a story like this, we're like acknowledging that we don't know our neighbors. And that's a problem in modern society, a contemporary society, obviously, where I think when I was a kid and we moved into a new house, the neighbors would bring over hot dogs or whatever and introduce themselves. Like when I moved into this house, although I do actually know all my neighbors, the woman across the street came over and yelled at me because my car was parked in front of my house as I was moving. And she was upset because it took her all that space to back her car out. I was like, okay, what's going on? You know, it's just a different kind of perspective on new people and neighborhoods. And every neighborhood's different and every person's different. But there is that acknowledgement, like you don't know your neighbors, so you don't know what they're feeding you.
And honestly, there's no harm in double-checking candy or to verify the safety of your child. But whipping people into a panic about a hypothetical maniac isn't a great plan. And hopefully this is all kind of comforting. At least on this topic, our neighbors aren't nearly as psychotic or unstable as they've been made out to be for over half a century. So keep an eye on your kids, but let them have the experience of running around with their friends, showing off their costumes, working on communication skills, and engaging with your neighbors. The age of trick-or-treating doesn't last forever, so let them make memories for as many Halloweens as they can. And since we've referred to his work so frequently in this episode, I think it's only fair to give Joel Best the final quote. Everyone knows that Halloween sadists have been responsible for countless deaths and serious injuries. Fortunately, everyone is wrong. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Back Away Slowly. A thank you to our guest, Heather Joseph Witham. A reminder that you can support the show via the links in the show notes, as well as our socials. Next week's episode is a bit of a silent titan. It's one of the oldest urban legends we know of, with witness testimony from countries all over the world. I'll tell you all about it next week. Bye.